My friends at Easy Cater are workplace catering pros, helping you find food for everything from daily employee meals to staff meetings and special events. Visit easycater.com/leaderassistant to find out more.
Hi, this is Ann Hiatt, and today's leadership quote is from Diane von Furstenberg. She said, "I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I always knew the woman I wanted to be."
The Leader Assistant podcast exists to encourage and challenge assistants to become confident, game-changing leader assistants.
Hey friends, thanks for tuning in to episode 123 of the Leader Assistant podcast. You can check out the show notes at leaderassistant.com/123. And before we jump into today's exciting and engaging interview, I wanted to invite you to check out our upcoming event schedule. These are professional development and training events for executive assistants, executive business partners, and other administrative professionals. You can check out our schedule of virtual events, and also we're starting to get into planning more live in-person events as well. So check out the schedule at leaderassistantlive.com. That's leaderassistantlive.com. Hope to see you at one of our events, and I hope you enjoy this interview. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the Leader Assistant podcast. It's your host, Jeremy Burrows, and today I'm very excited to be speaking with Ann Hiatt. Ann is a leadership strategist and consultant. She founded her own global consulting firm, and she's also an author. We're going to talk about her book in a minute. And then she's formerly the right hand to CEOs Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Eric Schmidt of Google. Ann, how's it going?
Great. Good to see you, Jeremy. It's nice to be in conversation again.
Yeah. So where are you at in the world right now?
I actually right now am coming to you from Ibiza. My husband is like, "You have a emergency business trip to Ibiza? That doesn't add up." But I really did. Literally, I booked the ticket yesterday. I have a client meeting tomorrow morning. So yes, coming to you live from my hotel room in Ibiza. I actually had to close the blackout curtains because it's so distractingly beautiful outside. Wow. I have to stay in work mode for now.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Let's just jump right in. And Why don't you tell us a little bit about how your career started?
Very unexpectedly. Let's see, how much time do we have? It's like a 10-hour story. No, really my life, my destiny was chosen for me a little bit by my parents unintentionally. They moved to Redmond, which is a suburb of Seattle, in 1985. And they did not expect that the personal computing revolution was about to happen literally less than 5 minutes from our front door. Microsoft headquarters was founded right around that same time. And I grew up surrounded by tech. All the parents of my friends worked in tech. It was just kind of everywhere in the air, although I had no personal intention of ever going into technology. So my undergrad, I studied international studies at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I was graduating from undergrad in 2002. And that was immediately after the dot-com bust, which had wiped out a lot of the U.S. economy, but especially in Seattle. And so I and all of my friends had zero job prospects at graduating. And so I was working a student position at the European Union Center on campus at UW. And the director of my program asked what I was going to do. And he said, "Well, if you're not having any luck with plan A, have you ever thought of applying at Amazon?" Because his wife was working in recruiting there. And that is literally the only reason I applied at all, was thanks to pandemic number one of three that I've been, well, that wasn't really a pandemic, but crisis number one of the three I've had experienced across my career. And so 9 months later, it was a very long hiring process. But my very first job out of university was sitting at the desk, the closest to Jeff Bezos in the entire company for 3 years.
Wow. Yeah, that is, it's crazy how things just kind of happen sometimes, huh?
Yeah.
9 months hiring process.
Yeah. It was terrible.
So did you have to do like a temp, like a 90 day test or anything? Or was it literally just interviews and waiting and interviews and waiting?
Yeah, it was the latter, unfortunately. So I went in for a first round of interviews, and traditional to tech, this is still true in many tech companies today, they're just looking to hire smart people and then they'll figure out where to put you. So I was just being vetted to see if I could hack it in that crazy environment that was early years of Amazon. So I came in and they considered me for a junior assistant role. And I interviewed with all of the assistants of the company. At the time, I think there were 11, which is really funny because Amazon was less than 1,000 people back then. We were like 900 something. Now they have 1.3 million employees. Can you imagine?
Yeah, that's crazy.
That's like, it just boggles my mind to think of that many employees for a single company. But yeah, so I interviewed with all of them. And then I didn't hear anything back for 3 months. So I thought I bombed it because honestly, I hadn't prepared that well for that interview. I'd never, it was my first job out of school. And I'd never, tech interviews are kind of crazy by reputation anyway, but I didn't know that. So, but I loved it. Like they had such enthusiasm and such pride in the projects that their teams were working on and what they were supporting. And it just got in my blood. So I got really excited about it. And then they didn't call me back for like 2.5 months. And then I went in for a second round because I found out later I had scored really well. And the second round was with VPs. And I thought, why on earth are they wasting VP time with me? But I didn't know that I was being considered for an opening in Jeff Bezos' office. So I scored really well on that second round as well, even though 3 of those interviewers had been assigned to find my breaking point and see if they could make me cry, which it sounds mean, but it was an important test because you had to have very thick skin back then. We were just running so fast. We couldn't have any fragile flowers. So I did okay. And so the head of legal, she came to Jeff and was like, look, you can hire her or I'm going to. And he's like, whoa. So that's how I ended up with a third interview is they called me back in. They did not tell me that it would be with Jeff Bezos himself, but it was. And he only asked me 2 questions and then hired me on the spot.
Wow. Can you share what those 2 questions were?
Yeah. I didn't know, but this was famous at the time for being Jeff's go-to interview question. So he said, don't worry, I know you've done a lot of interviews. I'm only going to ask you 2 questions. This is the last. But the first is going to be a brain teaser. And, I'm really young. I've never done formal rounds of interviews before, so no one's ever asked me a brain teaser, although I knew that was kind of a thing. Like at Microsoft, they like to do that. So he asked me to estimate the number of panes of glass in the city of Seattle. And at first I was super confused. I was like, why would you ask me that question? But then I decided, okay, he wants to see how my mind works. Like, can I take a complex problem and break it down into manageable steps that would reach a solution? So I did that. We were in what I later discovered was Jeff's personal conference room. So he stood up, uncapped a pen and said, don't worry, I'll do the math. And I was like, what? But we did the math. We filled 3 of the 4 walls in his conference room were whiteboards, and we filled the whiteboards with the math until we got to an answer. We went through all the different scenarios of where you would find glass, and I kind of outlined it, and we did the math until he circled an answer. And then the second question was just, tell me about why you want to work here and what your goals are. Like, what do you want to learn by being here? And I think that it was actually the latter one that I think made him think like, all right, I think, because by then it was really, really exciting what they were working on. I really wanted to be part of it. And I knew that something irreplicable was happening there. And I just wanted in. I didn't fully comprehend what it was they were doing, but I wanted to be part of that team. I mean, Jeff was kind of a known personality at the time. He'd been Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 1999. Then he was on the cover of all the important newspapers and magazines for a long time. There's critical headlines about like Amazon.bust and all these things. People were very skeptical that they would ever turn a profit. So when I started, just a few months after that interview with Jeff, we had not yet been profitable. They had one single profitable quarter, but not yet profitable. If you can imagine that, like now they're so dominant. But yeah, we were fighting for our lives every day. So I entered the front lines of a battlefield on that first day and never looked back. I loved it.
So how long were you there?
3 years. 3 years. Yeah. I was lucky enough to sit at one of the original door desks built by Jeff's own hands. So it's famous lore in the company. When he started the Amazon in the garage of his rental home in Bellevue, Washington, he spent every night packing boxes on his hands and knees in his garage. And eventually his knees got really tired. So he originally went to Home Depot to buy knee pads. And then it occurred to him what he actually needs were tables. But he looked at the tables and thought they were ridiculously expensive for his purpose. But doors were on sale. So he bought the doors and just put them on, like cobbled them together into desks. And now that's really famous. So I sat at one of the original 3-door desks that Jeff made at the desk closest to him in the company for 3 years.
Wow. So is there any crazy stories you can share? And I mean, obviously it was a crazy time, and I know we don't have all day, but
yeah. How much time do you have, Jeremy? So many crazy stories. I have some favorites, and actually I'm having this great full circle moment right now. Because one of my favorite things that happened in the first year was I got to partner with Andy Jassy. Andy Jassy was the very first official shadow. That was literally the official job title, was the shadow. And the shadow, that person's job was to be at Jeff's side at all times. Copied on every email, in every meeting, on every flight, every phone call, every briefing document, everything, for a couple of reasons. One was to give Jeff kind of a sparring partner, somebody whose job was full-time to poke holes in all of Jeff's favorite ideas, make sure he was anticipating things, asking the right questions, not having any blind spots. And then second was to really learn to think like Jeff. Because Jeff knew that very, very quickly, soon after I joined, he was no longer going to be able to be the voice of authority in all rooms. The company was just getting too big, too fast. So he really needed to instill his very unique leadership principles throughout the company, like pervasively. And so Andy did that very, very well. And Andy now famously, he went on after his year and a half as the shadow to found and run what became a multi-billion-dollar subsidiary company, which is Amazon Web Services. And then you might have heard him in the news recently because Jeff has recently named him as his successor as CEO of Amazon, coming up very shortly. Actually, that transition's happening really soon. So it's a great moment for me to remember those early years when Andy and I were both just trying to figure out how to keep our heads above water. But the reason why, like, one, I'm really proud of Andy and so excited for these opportunities for his growth. But two, is one of the most important business lessons, those aha moments that we have occasionally, happened in watching Jeff and Andy interact. So I had this moment where Andy came over to ask me a question. He was going to present something to Jeff, and he wanted my advice on if he was coming about it the right way, because at that point I knew Jeff better than Andy did. And when he came over to ask me advice on how to present something to Jeff, it clicked that in some ways I was more of an expert than he was, even though he was much more technically senior than I was. And I just had this moment of being like, oh my gosh, I have access to the same things the shadow does, to the same emails, to the same meetings, the same phone calls, the same briefing documents. Why don't I treat my job like the shadows and create this Jeff Bezos apprenticeship for myself? And it was just more of like a mental shift than anything. You know, I still was the junior most person in the office and did a lot of intern level stuff, but I saw it differently. I invested in it differently. I dug in even deeper. I did a lot of homework. I Googled every name and term and acronym I didn't understand. And I just really treated it like my own personal business school. And that was a really important shift. And it prepared me for a disastrous first project that I had, which if anyone's heard me speak, they've probably heard the helicopter story. But that was the moment where that aha moment had to come first, and then disaster came, and then the rest of my life changed. It's like a sliding door moment for me in that.
What's the short version of the helicopter story?
The mini version of the helicopter story. And to tease my book, it's chapter 3. So if you want all the salacious details,
there you go.
It's in there. But the mini teaser version, so you're going to be wanting more, is so it was a couple of months after I'd been hired, and I'd just been, basically trying to keep my head above water and get trained. And my manager, John Connors, I love John so much. He taught me, all the best practices I use today really came from the foundation training that John gave me. And John to this day is still in that role with Jeff. And he's just amazing person and really a great manager. So mostly I'd just been taking direction from John, trying to learn the ropes and who the different people were and what we were inventing. And Jeff came to me a couple months in, and it was the first time I think he'd spoken to me directly since he hired me. And he gave me this assignment. He said, I want to go to Texas and view these properties next week. I have Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday to view them in. And he kind of walked away. And the paper he gave me just had this long series of numbers on it, which confused me at first. And I thought, maybe this is another brain teaser. But it turns out it was GPS coordinates. And I thought, well, that's a weird way of giving me addresses of places you want to visit. But it turns out he was looking at buying ranches, like huge plots of land in Texas. And when I plotted it out, it was actually impossible to visit all the properties on the list in the amount of time that he gave me. So I went to John and I was like, hey, okay, maybe we can narrow down this list, or maybe we can add a day. And John didn't even look up. He was just like, well, no is not an answer, so figure it out. And I went back to my desk and like, okay. So I thought, all right, we had chartered a jet. And I thought, okay, there isn't a runway to use the jet, and it takes way too long to drive. So they were very far apart. And then eventually it came to me, and I was like, well, what's in between that? Maybe a helicopter. So I went to John and I was like, how about we hire a helicopter? I think we can get to all these properties in time that way. And he was like, yeah, okay, do that. But I'm like early 20s. I don't have a Rolodex of anybody, let alone a Rolodex with a helicopter pilot in it. So I had no idea how to do that. But eventually I thought, okay, I'll reach out to the charter company and see if they can connect me with a pilot. And so I booked my first helicopter,
Nice.
Did all the security briefings, like all this kind of clearance stuff that hadn't occurred to me that would be part of my job. And I hired it. And Jeff went off and he came back like a kid on Christmas morning, like so excited. And nobody had any idea what he was doing in Texas yet. And so he was like, great, I've narrowed it down. I want to visit my favorite 2 next week. Let's do that trip again. And so I thought at this point, I was like, oh, well, I know what I'm doing. I've got the charter pilots. I've got the helicopter pilot. Easy peasy. And then off he went on the second trip. Now, at this point, I had realized how little I understood about the basics of my job. So I started coming in early every morning and doing my self-imposed homework of reading briefing documents and searching all the terms and people I didn't know. And I was at my desk. I think it was just me and security in the building at the time. And my desk phone rang, and it was the charter pilots. They had never called me before, but they said, I don't want to alarm you. So, of course, I was instantly alarmed. I said, we don't want to alarm you, but an emergency beacon has gone off and a helicopter has crashed.
Oh, wow.
And my hand starts shaking so bad I can't hold a pen. And I think to myself, I just killed Jeff Bezos. And not only had I maybe just killed Jeff Bezos, but the entire company, because all of the value of our stock was based on faith in Jeff and his crazy vision. I mean, again, we were not profitable. This was very early stage, and I might have just killed the entire company. So I think to myself, okay, what do I do? What happens if you kill your boss? And so I thought, okay, the board of directors needs to know. So I called John at home and I said, I think we need an emergency board of directors meeting. And he agreed. So he started assembling them while I started calling local hospitals, not using Jeff's name because maybe it wasn't him. And I didn't want to create some kind of press storm around nothing. So called several hospitals. They answered like I was a crazy person when I asked if any helicopter crash victims had come in. And then I think it was the 4th or 5th one, finally they asked me if I was family. So I had found him, and I just asked that he please call as soon as he could. When he called in, immediately patched into the board of directors. He told them absolutely do not issue any proactive statements because we'd prepared things for if he was dead, if he was injured, if he was alive, if it wasn't him. And he said, don't use any of that. Let's bury the story as much as possible. I don't want anyone knowing I was in Texas. What we didn't know, and now we know, because I think in like a week or two, this is full circle, but he was buying the property, which became Blue Origin, his space company, his rocket company. And the property that he bought and crashed in is where he's sending himself off into space next week. So what had happened was it was him. He was in the helicopter. The helicopter I hired did crash with him inside. He was the superhero of the day. So I have a feeling he loves telling the story. I literally have sweaty palms right now. Every time I tell it, I get heart palpitations. But he jumped out. He pulled out the pilot. He saved the ranch owner, his personal assistant who were in the back, climbed up to the top of the hill next to them and used the satellite phone I had insisted he take. And he called for help. And he did so using his own name. So that's the only reason I can tell this story right now is because a reporter broke the story when he was writing a story on the X Prize. About 9 months later, he figured out what Jeff was doing and broke the story and found those emergency call records in Texas.
Wow.
So, really, really crazy. But I think the most important part of that story for me was after he spoke to the board of directors, he asked to speak with me. And I expected him to be really upset. Like, I thought he might fire me. Maybe I'd done something wrong or I'd skipped a procedure or something. And instead, he just said, Anne, I hear you're really good under pressure. And maybe he said more than that. I don't remember. I think my ears started ringing. It's the nicest thing I think anyone's ever said to me professionally, because it was a moment of click where he no longer saw me as the 20-year-old who had no business having this job and did not know what she was doing, which was true. But it didn't matter anymore because he now saw me as somebody who could figure it out. I could be in a crisis situation and keep a cool head. I could ask the right questions, try the right things. And in his mind, none of us knew what we were doing. So that was okay. As long as I was a smart person who could figure it out in the moment, that would be all right. And then probably more importantly, I had the same realization. I finally saw myself differently, that even though I didn't know what I was doing, I could figure it out. And so why not go big and go bold? So I was recently talking to a reporter, a Financial Times reporter in San Francisco, and he asked me, he's like, what exactly was your job title at Amazon? Because like the stuff I've read, like it's all over the place. And I was like, well, that's because I did so much far outside of my job description after that. I wrote his original TED Talk. I helped with the Paris Hilton jewelry launch when we launched that category for the first time. Or when we launched sporting goods, I did the Anna Kournikova like press launch in Grand Central Station in New York. I was working on crazy stuff that was far outside my traditional job description because I was the one that he felt like he could trust to do stuff for the first time. So that really opened up my mind to not allowing myself to play in a small sandbox, but to volunteer for big stuff that otherwise I never would have been tapped for.
Wow. Amazing. Thank you for sharing. And yes, definitely, if you're listening, check out Anne's book. We'll put the link in the show notes so that you can read more about that story and others. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But tell us real quick, did you get invited to go to space with Jeff?
No. Somebody asked me, no, is the short answer. And I'm still waiting for my invite, Jeff, because I totally would go. Literally, if he was like, hey, fly to Texas next week, let's go, I would definitely get on that rocket ship.
Wow.
Because I don't know. I was there in the infancy, like the conception of this idea. I saw it grow over the last few decades. And what better way to go? I mean, we're all going to die, so why not go on? Now, I do know that the headline would be Jeff Bezos, an unidentified female, die in a rocket spaceship, but that's okay. At least I go out spectacularly. Yeah, I would totally go.
Nice. Okay, so let's transition. So you went from Amazon to Google. So you went from, one of the biggest companies in the world to one of the smallest. I'm just kidding. How was that transition? Why did you jump to Google? And what did you learn in your time working with Eric and working at Google?
Yeah, I actually made a pit stop in between. So I left Amazon actually to start a PhD. So that had always been plan A, told Jeff about it in the original interview, that was something I wanted to do. And he was very supportive. Tech is very much education snobs, so there will always support a PhD plan. After 3 years at Amazon, I applied to my programs expecting it to take a year or two to get into my ideal programs, because at that level, it's all about fit. You need someone kind of who's just like finished their PhD, moving. There needs to be a vacancy, so there's funding to support you and in the program that fits you best. So I really thought it would take a couple years for that magic moment to happen. But it actually happened the very first try. So I got into my dream program at Berkeley in California. So that's originally what took me out of Seattle and down into Silicon Valley. And so I was studying at Berkeley, and that was actually really important because in that program, I was the only person starting my program that year. I didn't have any peers. It seemed like everyone else knew what was going on. I was coming from this very linear, data-driven environment, super fast-paced environment of Amazon. And now suddenly I was just my classes were like 3-hour-long discussion sessions where we just sat around a table and discussed what we read. And I didn't know how to measure, like, how do I know if I'm doing a good job? But it really taught me the value of asking the right questions, learning for learning's sake, and just seeing things from multiple perspectives and allowing these moments of clarity or click to come. And I really learned a lot about my thought process and how to be creative and how to channel kind of my critical thinking skills and creativity. And that was unexpected training for what came next, which was Google. So after about a year in my PhD program, Google heard I was in town because tech is a very small world, especially back then. And they asked if I was interested in coming and working at Google because based on my work with Jeff. And I said, thanks very much. Nope, super happy with academics. That was fun, but no, thank you. And I think even back then, that was 2005, I don't think a lot of people were saying no because Google was already a pretty hot place to work, even though they weren't the dominant search engine yet. So I said no for about a year or so. And then eventually the recruiter's like, well, don't you want to come for a tour? You're probably kind of curious about the campus. And that was smart because I was. And so I thought, okay, I want to see the cafes with the free food and that everyone brings their dog to work and they're all playing like sand volleyball. I want to see how anyone gets anything done in this kind of crazy environment. And while I was there, it happened. I mean, we were eating lunch, and whether by design or by accident, I found myself eating between someone who had raced in the U.S. Postal Team with Lance Armstrong in the Tour de France, former astronaut, like not just an astronaut, literally had been to space, and Vint Cerf, who was one of the founders of the internet. These were the Googlers, happened to sit at the table that I had lunch at. And I thought, okay, because really my main hesitation in leaving my PhD was I loved being surrounded by the smartest people in the world and talking about big issues. I really wanted to have a global impact. And the recruiter literally laughed at me and he was like, I think you would be pretty comfortable here. And he was right. So I did not expect that was the start of a 12-year career at Google. So my first role was working for Marissa Mayer on the product team. She was in charge of the homepage, Gmail, all the kind of stuff, the cool stuff that just brought eyes in. Other people figured out how to monetize it, but we just got to make cool stuff. And so we were launching like crazy. We were in a race. I can't even, looking back, I'm like, how did we launch so many things in such tight sequence? It was crazy. It was all hands on deck all the time. We were constantly in a sprint. We were constantly in war rooms. We were constantly like doing launch prep and code reviews. And I loved it. It was just, some people get that adrenaline in their blood. And that's me. Like I really, some people burn out in that environment, but no one in the early years of Google. Like we were just, all of us, that was our lifeblood. So I worked with Marissa for 3 years and learned so many incredible, valuable lessons that I call on every day now in my consulting with startup CEOs around the world, because I really learned some best practices from her about how to build a high quality team, how to empower your people and make them feel valued, how to not burn them out while running 18-hour days for years on end. She just really had that down to an art. And I've never seen somebody who invests so heavily in the team that they've built. And then after 3 years with her, then I moved on to work for Eric for the 9.5 years of the second part of my career at Google. First 3 years, he was still CEO and then executive chairman.
Wow. So what's maybe one thing you could share that was different about Google than your time with Amazon?
Yeah, there's so much. The culture's very different. I think that's the biggest difference. Like the launch cycles and the pace and the bold, fearless goal setting, it was very similar. I think that has a lot to do, the similarities have a lot to do with John Doerr, who was an early investor and board member in both companies. And John Doerr introduced the goal setting system called OKRs, which stands for Objectives and Key Results. And that's now pervasive in most tech companies and beyond now, but it was revolutionary at the time. So using that OKR goal system, it moves you out of just thinking about KPIs and solving the problems under your feet today, and it instead shifts your horizon and gives you permission to fail and to celebrate the learnings that come from that, because you're setting such audacious goals that you know for a fact you're not possibly going to accomplish. But, you know, as they say, like you shoot for the stars and you might hit the moon on the way, or however that saying goes. That's what we were doing every day. So it just both places had an environment that celebrated how much you learn when you try really crazy stuff. Now, the differences might be the character of the founders. Like Jeff has his own very particular personality. He's very intense, and he's now famous for the way that his senior executives present to him. He liked to have 6-page memos. That's a system he developed while I was with him, where everything is kind of presented as a fully packaged report. He called it the PR FAQs. The PR statement, imagine the news headline the day you launch it. What is the one sentence takeaway? And then the FAQs are all the things the reporter is going to ask you about it and how you're going to present it and have solved some problems. That is similar at Google, but Google's a little bit different. We were very much making it up as we went a little bit, because we were just moving so fast and building so many things. And so I think it's just a little bit different in terms of the character. I also think Jeff brought in some more senior people, whereas at Google in those early years, we were all very young. The age of our average employee tracked the age of our founders. And so we went through some funny growth cycles together where everyone was kind of single in the original years. Then everyone kind of got married at the same time. Then the whole company had babies at the same time. So even the types of offsites we were doing changed over time based on, you know, whatever life stage the company was at. And now it's, of course, all over the place. But at Amazon, I just really felt like we were very much making it up as we went, and they just trusted you. If you had made it through the interview cycle at Google, they trusted you to be insanely smart and be able to figure it out. So it was very hands off. You were just trusted to just figure it out and get the right thing done. There wasn't a lot of red tape. There wasn't a lot of approval procedures. That's definitely not true today. But we were just doing our best and making it up as we went.
Wow. So, we'll kind of transition to your book, but I wanted to see if you had thoughts on titles for assistants. So, you know, you said you had so many different titles because your role was just so broad and random at times. What do you think, for those listening, you know, most of my listeners are executive assistants, administrative business partners, some chiefs of staff. I like to say titles don't really matter. It's that you love the work and that you're getting compensated fairly. What are your thoughts on titles for assistants?
Yeah, I agree with you, Jeremy. I never cared what my title was. I absolutely cared about advancement. I absolutely cared that I was being treated with respect, which thankfully I was very, very lucky. I always was. I had executives who treated me as the absolute business partner that I was. So it was about 6 years or so into my tenure at Google when they had the conversation about changing our titles. Originally, it was the traditional administrative business partner, administrative assistant, executive assistant. Then some of the original EAs and I were tasked with creating the ladder. So there were back then 5 levels to the admin ladder. And after we had done that, really crafted out what at each level could you expect from that person. For example, what types of projects should they be given? What type of delegated authority level do they have? Are they doing cross-functional work, etc.? And once we had crafted those ladders, it became really clear that there was this huge opportunity for growth and progression and increased impact in the company. And that started a natural conversation about, well, is this title reflective of what's the word I'm looking for? Like the incredible amount of responsibility that this job ladder has in the company. It's the entire backbone and skeleton of the company rides on that. And so that started a conversation that at the time I didn't care about. The conversation was really about, we want titles that reflect that level of delegated authority and the responsibility that we hold. And they came up with the titles of executive business partner and administrative business partner that is now fairly pervasive across companies, even outside of tech now. And at the time I was like, yeah, sure, that's fine. And now I really think that was a great move because it was so reflective. And the whole purpose of titles is to signal how people should expect to interact with you and what decisions you can be making. And I do think that that was an important way of indicating if you're talking to an EA at Google, you can expect someone who is also a very experienced project manager, who has a high degree of delegated authority. And I felt like that title did reflect that. I also was the first wave of chief of staff when I asked for that title. It didn't yet exist anywhere, let alone at Google. And for me, that was a signaling of, again, leveling up. Most of my responsibility in no way resembled my work on the EA ladder anymore. And in fact, I think I was at Google for 12 years because I was given the ability and entrusted in to really change my game. Looking back, I think it's every 3 years. My first 3 years of Google were just figuring out how on earth to get anything done in this crazy environment, building up those relationships of trust, what I call friendship currency. Then I transitioned to being able to be very proactive, making recommendations, representing Marissa in rooms she wasn't in. Then I moved into Eric's office and did that at the board level and senior executive level. So that was kind of another chapter. And then that last chapter of being chief of staff, where my responsibilities were empowering and enabling these senior executives during a time of massive transition. First, when we restructured from being Google into Alphabet, which nobody understood at the time, including us. We're very much making that up as we went. And then second, when Eric transitioned from being CEO into executive chairman, because Google had never had a full-time chairman before and Eric had never been one before. So we had to decide what were his key results and what did success look like. And so that was an opportunity for me to realize, wow, his job is completely changing and so should mine. And so I designed a career ladder for myself that I thought reflected best what he was going to need from me as his right-hand partner. Because in that transition, he actually let go of everyone who reported to him except for me. All of the SVPs, all of his staff, assistants, everybody, speechwriters gone except for me. And so it was really kind of this clean slate for both of us to be like, okay, what's our impact? What are we going to do here? How are we going to be held accountable? And so that was really empowering. So in one hand, I absolutely don't think the titles matter, but I do think that up-leveling and consistently reinventing yourself is really important. In fact, in the book, I highlight this, and I call it creating your dream resume. Now, this dream resume exercise actually has nothing to do with titles, nothing to do with companies you want to work for or titles you want to have. In crafting this dream resume, it's very much a thought exercise about what projects do you want to be owning, what authority level do you want to be at, what cross-functional impact do you want to have, and what sort of legacy are you making, not at the end of your career, on retirement day, but like what legacy are you creating today based on the projects you're working on right now. And I think that's a really liberating thought exercise because you probably, I'm hoping in doing it, if you dig in deep enough, you realize there's opportunities available to you right now in the role that you have today, in the company you're at today, where you can actually deepen your impact in a way that maybe wasn't obvious based if you're thinking within the confines of your job description.
That's great. So perfect segue. So your book is called Bet on Yourself, Recognize, Own, and Implement Breakthrough Opportunities. Comes out October 2021, so not too far away. What kind of drove you to write this book?
I was actually very reluctant. It took years of people talking me into it. The reason I was reluctant was because, one, I don't want to pretend that I know all the answers or that I'm in any way perfect or have stuff figured out. Very much a work in progress. And I've learned that that's okay. From my CEO, mentor, bosses, they are very much figuring out as they go. So I feel full permission to do that. So I don't want to pretend that I'm like, here's a playbook for how to be perfect just like me. That's not what this book is. This book is actually some of the best practices of the CEOs I've worked for. And I use my career as a case study of how I watched them have this incredible impact on the stages they were on and how that inspired me to take some steps within my career. So what I've done is I've translated these best practices for us normal people, quote unquote, normal people. And to realize, because otherwise we can opt out. We think like, oh, well, if Jeff Bezos does that, I'll never be Jeff Bezos. So why try? Or I'll never be Eric or Marissa. And actually, I realized in looking back that I had translated a lot of those best practices into my very normal regular career. I don't think there's anything particularly exceptional. I'm not like a Fulbright scholar or, an Olympian or something. Like, I'm just a regular person. But I do feel like I was able to create some exceptional things out of very ordinary circumstances that otherwise would have passed me by. And I feel this calling to do that for other people. This book is also an attempt to answer the question for why these 3 highly impactful visionary CEOs who could have anybody on their teams, why all 3 of them chose me. That's a very hard question for me to even say out loud because it just feels so hoity-toity and like I'm important. But I think it's an interesting question because there is some secret sauce there. And I feel like that if I could do that for Jeff and Marissa and Eric, I want to do that for each individual reader. What I'm most proud of in my work was I helped them build their wildest dreams. And if I can do that on the ridiculous, like literally building a rocket ship into space scale, I can certainly help you do it in your career goals. So that's my big goal. I want to take these best practices and empower each individual reader to do that, to live their biggest dreams.
Love it. Well, we'll definitely post those, the link to your book to pre-order it in the show notes. And I'm definitely excited to check it out myself. So you mentioned in the book blurb, you mentioned leadership principles and just kind of talking about that. So the last question I want to ask, that I like to ask my guests is, what makes an assistant a leader?
What doesn't make an assistant a leader? It'd be much easier to answer in the reverse. Honestly, I think it comes down to the fact that our entire job description is to be their representative, to be their voice and their influence when they're not in the room. And I can't think of a greater leadership responsibility than that, is to represent their ideals, their standards, their voice, their opinion, their vision when they're not in the room. It's pretty exciting to be a body double for someone really important.
Yes, I agree. And that's why I've been in the role for 16 years. So
I love it.
There's never a dull moment. It's very exciting.
Never. Definitely not.
Awesome. Well, Anne, thank you so much for taking time to share your story. Definitely excited about your book. And how can people get connected with you and reach out?
Thank you. I'm really excited about this. I would love for this to be a back and forth conversation. So please do reach out. Probably the easiest way for all the connections is on my website, annhiatt.co. So that's ANNHIATT.co. And from there, you'll have the links to all my social, like my Insta and my LinkedIn. But you could also sign up for my newsletter. You can get the downloads of my podcast, also titled Bet on Yourself. And I have the website for the book coming out very shortly, which will be betonyourselfbook.com as well, for a lot more free resources around these same themes. So please sign up, check it out. And I would love to hear your examples and how you've kind of implemented some of these ideas into your own career and work.
Awesome, Anne. And I really appreciate you sharing these tips and your wisdom, because I think assistants, oftentimes we get stuck in our assistant training or assistant books or assistant world. And, I wrote an assistant book, so I'm not dogging assistant books, but I think it's great to hear from someone who knows what it's like to be in our shoes as EAs and chiefs of staff and business partners, but also just pulling from your executives that you worked with and sharing all that with everyone. So I appreciate you distilling everything into a book.
Thank you. Thank you. That means a lot to me. And thanks for having me, Jeremy. It's a real honor to be on your podcast.
Yes. Thanks for being here, and we'll definitely talk soon. Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes at leaderassistant.com/123, and be sure to check out Anne's new book, which is linked in the show notes.
please review on Apple Podcasts. GoBulls.com